Leslie Wells, Connection Coach here. Let's talk today about the Anxious-Avoidant Dance. Help individuals heal, thrive, improve their romantic relationships by looking at things through an attachment lens. So a lot of times we really sort of get stuck in this viewpoint of we think either the person who's avoidantly attached is really bad and their behaviors are harmful, and they can be, or the anxiously attached individual is doing things wrong and they are very bad. And I just want to show you today that it's not necessarily that either side is wrong. There's better ways, and I also want to show you that they're doing these things not as a way to harm, but as self-protective measures. They actually have learned their different techniques and their different trauma responses in response to their childhood and the events that happened there. And these were things that they had to adapt to survive and to find safety. So they implement these things subconsciously as a way to protect both themselves, it's self-protective, and to protect the relationship. So let's look at this in terms of conflict, because one of the biggest things that we see with avoidance and people with anxious attachment is that in a relationship, there's that push-pull dynamic, and it really comes out in conflict. So during conflict, what the anxiously attached individual will do in order to create safety for themselves and to preserve the relationship is they will try to lean in and reconnect. They have this internal sense of urgency and this frantic feeling that we have to reconnect and fix everything right now. And they do it usually, oftentimes, in very either clingy, urgent, these frantic ways, and that sense of urgency and that inner franticness that the avoidantly attached individual can feel is what really pushes them away. They can feel that dysregulation, and it's a turn off for them. It makes them feel dysregulated, and so that's why they sort of pull away and shut down. So it creates even more urgency for the anxiously attached individual to reconnect and fix things right then. And so then, of course, they're chasing and the avoidantly attached individual is running, and then they feel abandoned and rejected and they chase more. The avoidantly attached person is feeling more and more overwhelmed, and they're going into their trauma response in order to protect the relationship. This is subconscious. And so you end up with this chasing, running situation, and nothing gets resolved, and everybody feels bad, and they're in a trauma response. So what happens for the anxiously attached individual is they will either get clingier, they will really get urgent, like I said, they will come out in these big protest behaviors and sort of come across as desperate or angry whenever they're trying to reconnect. And what's happening for them is they have all of these unresolved feelings or problems in the relationship, and so they're trying to protect the relationship and protect themselves by regaining connection by going ahead and addressing the problem like immediately. Like, we've got to fix this right now, we've got to work through this, and we've got to get past it so the relationship is intact and everybody feels good and safe again and reconnected. They get their safety through reconnection. So anxiously attached individuals, whether it's a fearful avoidant or an anxious preoccupied, typically do better or have learned that they need co-regulation in order to create a sense of safety for themselves. So they like to be able to regulate with their partner. And so when they're feeling dysregulated, when there's a disconnect or a rupture in the relationship, whenever there's a reason that conflict comes up, that's when they will really need to reconnect and repair right away. And there's some good things to this, right? Because if you repair things quickly, rather than shoving them under the rug, and you face them head on, then you don't end up with resentment and anger and all these unresolved issues that just grow until they blow up later in the relationship. So there's some validity to the strategy that they are naturally using in order to reconnect. That disconnection is so incredibly painful for them that they really crave that reconnection in order to regain safety inside their own body and to feel like the relationship is solid again. Now, for the avoidantly attached individual, they get their safety through self-regulation. So when they feel like there's a problem, and when their anxiously attached partner brings them a conflict, they automatically feel like there's a problem, and their internal dialogue is that they have missed the mark, they're a failure, they're never going to get it right. So for them, what they do is they go into their self-regulation. So they pull away, they detach, they withdraw. They want to avoid the conflict at all costs. Their way of safety, protecting themselves, their self-protectiveness, is to do that self-regulation, because as a child, no one was emotionally available for them. That's the only way they were able to actually soothe themselves, was by themselves. They don't know how to co-regulate, so they can't really give the anxiously attached individual what they need. They also are doing this subconsciously. This is how they have adapted to protect the relationship. So because conflict is a bad thing and more feelings can come up, and a lot of times you end up in negative cycles in those conflicts, especially if you have an anxiously attached and avoidantly attached individual, you're going to see those common cycles come up again and again and again. So the avoidant knows that, and they're trying to avoid that. They are trying to preserve the relationship by not getting involved in conflict, which in their mind is going to disrupt the peace and harmony. And it's also going to lead to more negative feelings, more bad, painful feelings in their body and with their partner, because they know they don't usually have the right thing to say or know how to address it. So they know it's just going to get worse. And so they're trying to preserve the relationship by not allowing it to escalate and sort of hoping that time's going to mean that everything dies down. Anxiously attached individual is constantly trying to close that emotional distance, while the avoidantly attached person is sort of creating more emotional distance until things die down, so things don't get worse and make it harder to close that emotional distance later. They can both still go into protective measures for each other. So the anxiously attached individual, who a lot of times can be very hypervigilant, will sort of walk on eggshells so not to trigger their avoidant and push them farther away. And a lot of times, even though the avoidant is not super emotionally tuned in the same way, they still, because they really, their inner need is that peace and harmony, they will also try to sort of walk on eggshells to appease their partner and avoid conflict, because that doesn't feel good to them, and they also know that that means the relationship isn't in a good place. So they'll also walk on eggshells to sort of keep the status quo and not rock the boat per se. And for both the anxious and the avoidant, really it's the feelings that they're dealing with, that overwhelming pain, the somatic sensations that are going on in their body, that is the bigger problem that's causing them to show up anxious and avoidant in those moments. For people who are securely attached, they don't necessarily go through these things. People who are securely attached aren't in that protective state where they feel like they have to protect themselves, where the anxious and the avoidant feel like they have to protect themselves, and so they're coming across in these bad ways, and they're subconsciously trying to protect themselves and the relationship at the same time, and it just ends up being completely detrimental to both themselves, and they're not honoring themselves or really getting to the root of their true needs, and they're allowing themselves to get stuck in these trauma responses, and they're not showing up well in the relationship and giving their partner what they need, and the conflict is not being handled in a good way. Ultimately, conflict is a good thing in a relationship. It's a necessary thing for change. It's a necessary thing for figuring out what's going on with your partner and what needs to change. And it's going to happen. And the goal is for it to happen less. And even if it doesn't happen less, for it to be less intense and for you to be able to repair and pivot quickly and work through it in a way that leaves you feeling like you're a team and you have more closeness and intimacy versus all this emotional distance. So if it truly is that conflict brings about that they're more worried, and the bigger fear, the underlying fear, is more about experiencing the painful feelings that they're in, that's that franticness for the anxious person, and the avoidant who is overwhelmed by all the emotions and feeling like a failure, that's truly what they're afraid of. It's not so much really the conflict, it's those feelings. So the work for that is to learn to be able to let those feelings linger and to be able to sit in them longer. Of course, you got to learn new tools and techniques, but a big part of the work is actually being able to sit and let those feelings linger. And for the anxiously attached individual, that means actually being able to not have your partner to co-regulate all the time, but to be able to have some emotional distance and still work through that without losing your mind and going to this catastrophic place and thinking that things are terrible and that if you don't reconnect immediately that everything's going to blow up. For the avoidant, that's the same thing. They have to be able to sit and linger in that lack of peace and harmony, in that conflict, and hear the feedback that is being given to them and be able to sit in that and hold space for their partner rather than disengage or jump into quickly fix it, which is another way that they suppress their emotions, is to show up in facts and fixing instead of actually just sitting in that space and validating their partner's experience and being able to hold space for that anxiousness and that urgency that's inside of them. I just want to point out there are some good strategies here. There's better ones, but both of the things that the anxious and the avoidant are doing are self-protective measures, and they really are trying to protect the relationship. They just don't know a better way yet, and that's one of the things that I do in my coaching is help them find better tools, change their inner dialogue, and figure out better ways that they can break these negative cycles and show up better.